Hello, everybody, and welcome to Confrontational Histories, the YouTube channel that covers bad historical myths and narratives. The fall of France in 1940 is one of the most well known and narrativized, and yet least well understood events in world history. Some of these misunderstandings stem from a lot of honest and somewhat understandable mistakes that come from narratives that are prevalent within the popular culture. And some of these narratives were deliberately crafted by certain folks after the fact to make themselves look better and implicate other people in the mistakes of the events that had transpired. In this video, I'm going to address some of those common misunderstandings, talk a little bit about where they come from, talk about the real cause for the confusion and the environment that led to the fall of France, and get into those stories. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and ring the bell for notifications if you like the content of these videos. Now, Maginot, the Great Failure, something that worldwide has become synonymous with an inability to conceptualize what the future might be like, and France's determination, and indeed the determination of all victors of the last war, to fight the previous war over again. Let's get this first point out of the way right now. The Maginot Line did its job exactly as was intended. Some of you may be familiar with this already, but it's still a prevalent enough narrative that I put it up in the title and decided to lead with it. The construction of the line itself was not a strategic mistake, nor was it a sign that France had the wrong ideas or was fighting the last war, or that the French military were not considering and had not built their tactical doctrines around the notions of modern mobile warfare. Especially in the last 30 years or so, historians, including Julian Jackson, Clayton Donnell, and Ariel Roth, have challenged and overturned the popular view that the wall and the Maginot mentality itself were prohibitive to France. Now, if you still believe this narrative, if this is still something that you accept, don't feel bad about that. It's a very prevalent and popular narrative, not only amongst amateur historians, but also a lot of professional historians as well. However, if you understand France's strategic situation and understand the French strategy, then it's not very hard to debunk the notion of the Maginot mentality or the idea that the line itself was some sort of grand strategic failure. The French General Staff had every reason to think that World War II, or the next war, whatever that might be, would be a mobile war. As good of a film as it was in many ways, the 2022 version of All Quiet on the Western Front completely misrepresents the last few months of the First World War. The Western Front in the last few months of the war was an entirely fluid and mobile front, with the Americans, the French, and the British forces all using mobile infantry, trucks, tanks to break through and make large gains in the French line. But it is understandable when people think of the First World War, they think of that trench warfare. And, though the concept was in its infancy and the battles were still heavily ground infantry based, as I said, tanks, planes, automobiles were all still used to great effect by the end of the war by the Western Allies, who advanced over 100 miles in just a few months. When the French General Staff thought about what the next war was going to be like, they were thinking of those last few months. They weren't thinking of the grueling trench warfare that had preceded it. However, the French needed to prepare themselves for an essential strategic reality of fighting the next war. France had severe manpower disadvantages when it came to fighting a future war against Germany. This is a problem that they'd carried forward from the First World War when they had faced Germany. And Germany simply had a far larger population than France by the dawn of the 20th century. I'll circle back to some of the reasons for that later. In French literature, this is commonly called the population crisis. And while Germany did suffer terrible losses during the First World War, Germany's numerical advantage was not stunted by their battlefield losses during that war or the territorial losses after the war. Proportionate to their overall population, France suffered the highest manpower losses of any of the major Western combatants during the war. And by the 1930s, France could only afford to field about two-thirds as many men of fighting age as Germany could, and that was even before Germany's territorial acquisitions with the Anschluss and their other actions. France's heaviest losses were in the first year of the war, when the fighting between themselves and the German army was relatively wide open. And then later along the Franco-German frontier, where France fought alone as the only combatant against the German army because logistical concerns held the British and Belgian armies in northern France. It was at Verdun where the French military lost 400,000 men fighting over a small patch of ground over the course of about 10 months. Far from taking the Allies by surprise by moving into Belgium, the entire French war plan was based around trying to funnel the German army through Belgium again, so that way they could fight them in conjunction with the British and Belgian militaries. In that respect, the Maginot Line did exactly what it was intended to. The whole point of setting up the line was to create a barrier along the Franco-German frontier that the Germans would rather go around than fight through, and then this would give the French military time to call up their reserves and prepare for the battle that was going to take place on the Northern European plain. And so, again, in that respect, the Maginot Line did exactly what it was intended to. It acted as that shield that bought the French military precious months that they needed in order to be able to build up the forces that they needed to be able to fight Germany in this wide-open war on the Northern European plain. The French conception for how this war would take place was called War Plan Dial, and it was dependent upon maneuver. It was dependent upon mobile forces. It was entirely dependent upon the combined forces of the then allies, France, Britain, and Belgium, going on the offensive against Germany. And that was the battle that they were preparing for. It was not some static battle that lacked any maneuverability, or were the French conceived of the war as being a defensive war that was trench-driven like in the First World War. Now, in the years since the war, and even while the war was still going on, a lot of commentators and historians saw France's reliance on a large reserve army as a strategic error in and of itself, and as further proof of this Maginot mentality, the notion that they didn't need a large force that was combat capable and combat ready because the Maginot Line would protect them. A few minutes ago, I had introduced the concept of the population crisis, and it was something that was, as I said, it was very much a consideration of French strategic planners, and is also a source of popular narratives for the French right at the time, but also for a lot of modern conservatives, that France was being outpopulated by Germany because of liberal values or because of women's rights or what have you. And the causes of the population crisis in France are a lot deeper than some sort of turn of the 19th, 20th century liberal values or what have you. So to talk about this, we have to talk about deep demographics and the concept of crisis zones or struggle zones, or just, if you want to boil it down, areas where there are high degrees of conflict over a period of time until the main central strategic and geographic question in that region is settled. Now, world history is replete with examples of areas that were the subject of a lot of internal and external strife over an extended period of time. In the 16th, 17th, and the first part of the 18th century, this area was Germany itself. If you look at the 30 Years' War, and then a lot of the later wars were led by Frederick the Great, Germany was a major area of conflict during most of that entire time period, and the 30 Years' War especially had depopulated vast regions of Germany. And this depopulation, this constant warfare led to a lot of internal strife, which deepened the problems, led to a lot of outmigration. And for that reason, Germany struggled, not only population-wise, but also culturally, scientifically, not all areas of what we now consider modern Germany, or even what was part of Germany until the end of World War II. But large areas of Germany were pretty deeply affected by the conflicts that were going on there. And as I said, that led to a lot of depopulation, either through military deaths or disease or outmigration. Then starting in the mid-18th century and through the 19th century, France was the area that was a major crisis zone. You know about all the Napoleonic Wars, but also all the revolutions that took place there. And this, in turn, brought about significant stagnation within France's population. It did not grow at the same rate that a lot of other European powers grew. Up until this point, France had a lot of advantages in terms of geographic location, agriculture, trade, that led to a lot of growth in France, a lot of economic growth, a lot of cultural growth, scientific growth, but also population growth. And then you have to consider that unlike a lot of areas of Europe, such as England, Spain, Germany itself, France is a place where people actually wanted to live.
Your booze mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer.
But because people actually wanted to live there, France did not have the same sort of pressure valves and other outlets for dissidents and just for its general population that a lot of these other countries had. And a lot of those other countries, if they had a dissident population, they would just send them to the colonies. French colonialism looked very different from a lot of the colonialism of a lot of other European countries for this region. I mean, Germany wasn't colonizing, but it was sending a lot of its population to other countries. Not that this was a policy, it wasn't sending them deliberately, but a lot of people were choosing to leave Germany and go to the New World, or even go to France or Britain itself during this time period. And then if you want to carry this out even further, if you look at the 20th century, this region is now Russia. Russia has major demographic problems that really go back all the way to the First and Second World War and the revolutions. And it's a problem that they're struggling with right now. And it's already happened, but given enough time, the Middle East will probably become another such region that's become severely depopulated by the conflicts that are going on there. But all this led to a situation in the 19th century where France's population stagnated. Germany's did not. And Germany unified and defeated France in the First Franco-Prussian War. And the avalanche just started rolling along from there. Rather than this being a product of a couple of cultural changes that happened in France in the 19th century, this was a ball that had been in motion for a very long time, and it was something that French strategic planners had to plan around in the event of the next war. They couldn't withdraw large segments of their population to go and fight in the military because they had to have people in the factories. They had to have people who were managing the economy. They had to have people who were part of the economy. They needed people to manufacture equipment that the military would then take out and fight with. And so this France's determination to maintain a large reserve army as opposed to having a large professional army, that was part of the thinking that went to the wall. And it irked a large number of French generals at the time who wanted a large professional army, but that was also, there were other realities that were at play, political realities that prevented that from happening, and I'll get into those soon. But before we move on to that, I want to tackle the other major, incorrect narrative that has come out of the fall of France. The one that's often repeated by a lot of people who are a little more knowledgeable about what had happened and what the military situation was. And that's the notion that the French had simply not anticipated that the Germans could move a modern army through the Ardennes forest, and therefore were not capable of the maneuver that eventually surprised the French military and led to the systemic collapse of the Allied armies in the first days of the Second World War. And to talk about this, I want to talk about Millennium Challenge 2002. What is that? Why am I bringing that up? Millennial Challenge 2002 is a military exercise that was executed by the United States forces in 2002. It's become somewhat infamous in NatSec interested circles for what occurred and what came out of this military exercise. So the basic setup was that the United States military wanted to test out its new combat doctrines and its new combat systems in a controlled environment. So whenever you have one of these military exercises, you have a blue team who are the side that are committing the exercise, trying to test things out, and then you have the red team who represent the enemy. And in this case, red team was led by retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General Paul Van Ripper. Swear to God, I did not make that name up. Probably the greatest name that anyone could ever imagine for a Marine Corps general. If you use that name in anything other than a satire for a fictional property, they would probably throw it out for being too improbable, but that was the man's name. Awesome McAwesome name, deal with it. So what came out of this exercise was that Van Ripper used a number of unconventional asymmetric tactics that were designed to punch holes in what he saw were the flaws of the modern United States military net-centric warfare doctrine. And in the first day of the exercise, he was basically able to completely and utterly defeat the United States forces using unconventional tactics, older methods of transmitting messages, a lot of guerrilla-based tactics, just utterly obliterated the United States forces. Seeing this, the United States military did not look at their doctrines and say, gee, that seems like a problem. Instead, they reran the simulation, essentially rigging all the conditions of the simulation in order to guarantee a United States victory and to validate their new doctrines and the new expensive military equipment that they had purchased. Afterwards, Van Ripper accused the Pentagon of rigging the results so that way they could save face and they could take this information to the president and say, Mr. President, in future invasions that we're planning, I don't know where they would have been planning invasions at that time, but in future invasions that we're planning, everything worked out perfectly. We have nothing to worry about. And Van Ripper's basic assessment that the United States military was not up to fighting an asymmetrical war, that a lot of United States military doctrines would fail in the field in practical situations, and that a lot of this new United States military equipment was essentially trash and not really worth anything in a real battle against the type of forces that the United States would likely be facing. Well, that was essentially validated by what happened in the War on Terror. Now, you don't get to be a lieutenant general without being a good politician. And I am certain that Van Ripper was more than well aware of a lot of the political concerns that revolved around this exercise. The problem, though, is that Van Ripper believed that he was trying to solve a military problem. And he simply did not anticipate that what was really going on was a political problem. The Pentagon and the administration in power at the time and members of Congress wanted to have their methods, their ideas, the money that they had spent, and the determination to move towards their future goals. They wanted to have all of that validated. And so they really couldn't have cared less about the military problem that Van Ripper was trying to solve. So we then take this to France in the late 1930s. For the 1930s and then into the very early days of the Battle of France, the French military chief of staff was this mofo right here, Maurice Gamelin. And while Gamelin was responsible for a lot of the bad strategic decisions and tactical decisions that the French military made in the 1930s and then into the early days of the Second World War, Gamelin himself was in some ways a totem for political forces and interest groups that were active and powerful in France at the time. Now, saying that Gamelin was to blame for a lot of the strategic and tactical decisions that were made by the French military isn't to say that everything that he did was wrong or that he was a total incompetent. Gamelin was responsible for the planning around Plan Dial, which was the plan for the French counteroffensive against the Germans, and the whole theory behind funneling the German military through Belgium. But as the General Chief of Staff, it was Gamelin's responsibility to work with political leaders in order to formulate strategy, to garner the equipment that his men needed, and to maintain an open dialogue about the potential weaknesses of the French military. Now, in 1938, the commander of the French Second Army, which was responsible for defenses around Sedan and the Ardennes, was this king here, André Gaston Pillet. Now, Pillet was concerned about the defenses that were around the Sedan region. He believed that they were inadequate. There was a lot of incomplete work in this section of the Maginot Line, and he had concerns, perhaps, that if the German army were to burst through the Ardennes, that the entire French military plan could collapse because the French forces that were committed to the Dial plan could be separated from those on the Maginot Line. And so Pillet conducted an exercise in which he acquisitioned 7 divisions, 4 of which were mobile, 1 of which was an armored division, and sent them through the Ardennes and worked with timetables, both actual and theoretical, to figure out how long it would take for the Germans to be able to put a significant force through the Ardennes, but how long the French military would be able to defend the region in their current state. His military exercise concluded that if the Germans were to attack through the Ardennes with the force that was roughly the size of the one that he had specified, then they would break through French defenses at Sedan and be across the River Meuse within 60 hours. In reality, it took the Wehrmacht 57 hours to accomplish this task, and so he was pretty close to the mark on that one. So not only did the French military command know that it was possible for the Germans to send a modern mobile military force to the Ardennes, but they also knew that it was impossible for French military forces to defend Sedan with the numbers and with the fortifications that they had on hand already. And of course, they were well aware that a collapse of Sedan would drive a wedge in the French military that the Germans could then exploit. So why didn't anything happen? Well, with the exercise itself and with what they were able to extrapolate about what would happen after this circumstance to the French military, the conclusion was that if the Germans did try to go through the Ardennes, that French military defeat would be so complete that Gamelin essentially decided to bury the report because he thought it would cause political problems for him, raise questions about the viability of War Plan Dial, and also demoralize the army. General Pillet continued to protest, and for his efforts, he ended up being reassigned over to the Maginot Line defenses, thereby removing the general who was most familiar with the situation in Sedan and most familiar with the defenses in the Ardennes. Perlot was later in command of French forces and was one of the French generals who refused the order of surrender, at least for a few days after it was given, and continued to fight on against the Nazis despite being completely surrounded. So, good on him, especially when we compare him to a lot of the other French officers that we're going to cover later. But as it regards to the French General Staff in Gamelin and the Sedan, they essentially just hoped that the Germans wouldn't try this. Now, Gamelin did request a little bit more money for fortification, but he didn't mark it off as an urgent priority because most likely he didn't want to call attention to the exercise itself, and so the money was never allocated. Later on, when the new commander of the line, General Hertziger, requested 4 more divisions in April of 1940 for defense, Gamelin refused it because the assignment of new divisions would disrupt the plans for War Plan Dial. Now, speaking of historical narratives that might not be true, there is a very popular story that in one of his visits in 1938-1939, Winston Churchill pointed out to the French General Staff that the area around the Ardennes might be a weakness in a German military advance. And then the French leadership essentially stated that no modern military would be able to advance to the Ardennes. I looked around online. I looked through a number of references. I even checked Jenkins' biography on Churchill, and I was not able to find any confirmation for this. The only source I was able to find came from the International Churchill Society, and they've been known to kind of fudge things a little bit in the past. But I had heard this repeated so many times that I honestly myself took it for granted until I had to do the research for this video. And so if anyone out there has any information on this, please put it in the comments because I'm very curious now. But hey, I'm as imperfect as anybody else in terms of believing in a lot of these popular narratives that may or may not be true. But it is certainly the case that a number of people had recorded that in conversations, in briefings, this situation in the Ardennes was brought up over and over again as a potential weakness in the French military plan. And throughout the entire time period, Gamelin denied that it was a possibility for a German military advance through the Ardennes, and that everything was fine, and that you shouldn't have any questions about his plans. And so, whether or not this happened with Churchill, it certainly happened with a lot of other people. But ultimately, the Wehrmacht did burst through the Ardennes. They did cleave the Allied forces in two. They did create this massive hole in the French line, which they were then able to exploit. And so, if you're just looking at what was the immediate strategic cause for French military defeat, that's it right there. Combined with a lot of little things that the French military either planned around incorrectly in terms of their tank deployments, or the fact that they didn't issue radios to all of their units, or things that they couldn't even have anticipated, such as all the German soldiers being hopped up on meth. With that last one, I'm not saying that it's unfair or whatever, because all is fair in warfare. What matters is what gets you the win in the end. But in terms of French military planning, it would have been hard for them to plan around the German military having their soldiers be able to stay awake for 5 days. But even by then, even by the end after the first few weeks, German military advances slowed down. The French soldiers in the field were figuring out ways in isolated pockets to mount successful defenses or counteroffensives to German tactics and German movements. they were getting their hits back in. They were putting lumps on the German forces, and some of this may be because of the German forces coming off of their meth binge, but a lot of it was also good analysis of tactics. The French military commanders in the field starting to get a feel for what it was that the Germans were doing. And so why wasn't France able to compile everything that they learned and mount a broader counteroffensive, granted losing vast swaths of France by this point, but hanging on to what they had and then fighting back? And a lot of that has to do with the collapse of the political will of French politicians and the French general staff to fight this war. And so that gets us to part two, the most important grand strategic reason for why France fell in 1940. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before, but it is often said that if you were to go back to the turn of the 19th and 20th century and talk to somebody who was reasonably knowledgeable about world politics, and you told them that within 30 years' time there would be one country in Europe that was built around an ethno-state concept, anti-Semitism, far right-wing ideologies, and then you told them that there would be another country that was built around the principles of Karl Marx, then the average person would have assumed that the first country was either France or Russia, and that the second country was either Germany or Great Britain. Now, I think this does overstate the case some. France certainly had a long history of virulent anti-Semitism, of persecution of minority groups, and of the military intervening at certain times in order to stabilize the social situation. But it also had a fairly lengthy history of popular action, of popular democracy, of liberal values. And at least in a lot of the major cities, France was reasonably accepting and tolerant of a lot of religious and racial minorities who were coming from the colonies. Germany, on the other hand, had very limited history of democracy, either in government or in society or economic democracy. A lot of the governing institutions were run for or for the benefit of aristocrats, autocrats, the military, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Germany also. It just didn't seethe quite as much as French anti-Semitism did. But part of that was because Germany was the site of the first major culture war. Literally the Kulturkampf, which was a part of Bismarck's program, his internal program, to unify Germany by removing the political and social voice of a lot of the minority groups that were within Germany. And this wasn't only Jews, this wasn't only some remaining Slavic minorities, but also shaving away some of the unique aspects of German cultural areas and heavily persecuting political Catholicism, Catholicism as a political movement itself, in order to try to create this unified German society. So while a lot of this persecution wasn't bubbling at the surface, it was present, it was there. It was part of Germany's political culture, and in a lot of ways was just taken for granted. But there were instances, during the First World War, the German military high command conducted investigations of Jewish officers because they had suspected that the Jewish officers within their ranks were somehow involved in some sort of plot against the German military. Especially when things started to go badly, the German high command and high officials within the German government became quite suspicious of political minorities, of religious minorities, of ethnic minorities within the German army and the German state. But there is some truth to this notion. And the fact that history didn't go down the road that, as I said, if you'd posed this to somebody 120 years ago might have expected, has brought about a lot of attempts to search for reasons why German society was somehow uniquely perverse, that they went down this road when other Western countries didn't. But as someone once famously opined, that's a good story for another time. And while I do have a lot of issues with the basic premise of this entire area of research and this entire historical narrative that tries to find unique faults of German society, it's not really the focus of this video. But that still leaves the question, why didn't France fall to fascism? And the answer to that question is that France did fall to fascism. And I don't just mean that externally, I mean that internally as well. When you look at maps of France, you get the impression that France was partitioned after its defeat to Germany. You have this large zone up in the north and along the western coast where it's under German control. But that was just a military occupation. The Vichy government had control over the governance of the entirety of France, and their ability to operate within the occupied zone was a bit more limited. But for the most part, France during World War II was occupied by the French. Even in the military zone, aside from a couple of SS units, most of the German units assigned there were not the crack German divisions. It was largely Heavy units, as they were called, which is to say units that were comprised of soldiers that came from lands that Germany had occupied, Poland, Czechoslovakia, places like that. And even these units were fairly thin on the ground after you got past the Atlantic Wall. The Germans never really would have been able to hold on to France, especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union, without the full compliance of the French government. And the reason this situation maintained itself is because when Germany did defeat France, they found an almost uniquely compliant ally within the French right and the French far right. A huge swath of the French populace didn't really see the Germans as occupiers, they saw them as liberators, and as a chance to return to what they saw as sanity. So let's go back to the 1930s to talk about the Popular Front, the National Front, Action Française, and the overall political situation in France. And so we go back to the 6th of February, 1934. Edouard Daladier was about to take over as the 5th Prime Minister of France in less than 2 years. And conservative and right-wing protesters, many of whom were members of far right-wing leagues, gathered opposite the Palais de Bourbon to protest and voice their opposition to this new government. Along with rising social and political tensions and the ongoing and worsening Great Depression, the big concern in France at the time was a major financial scandal. It was a scandal that had involved many prominent members of French society and a number of members of the old government, and a number of the ministers for the incoming government had helped to cover up some of this. The major figure in this scandal was Alexander Stravinsky. Stravinsky, who happened to be Jewish, he happened to have been born a foreign national, had deep ties with a number of center-left and center-right politicians. Stravinsky, when he was found out, he attempted to flee. And when the police were closing in on him, the official story was that he had killed himself. But many on both the French right and the French left believed that Stravinsky didn't kill himself, and instead he had been intentionally silenced in order to prevent him from spilling the beans about a number of important French political, societal, and cultural leaders. Provoked by the far-right leagues, a number of protesters broke through the police barricades and stormed the Palais Bourbon, while the deputies were inside casting their votes to make Daladier prime minister. The police fought back and stopped the demonstrators, but at the cost of 15 dead and almost 1,500 people seriously wounded. Daladier resigned the next day, but the violence continued, and members of the centrist radical party decided to elevate Gaston de Maugre as their choice for prime minister in an effort to try to align themselves with center-right parties in order to try to stop the violence. Now, calls for a major right-wing turn within French society were nothing new. These sort of reactionary currents had been around in French society ever since the ascension of the first Napoleon Bonaparte, and then they found a new cause after the fall of Napoleon III and the empire in the birth of the Third Republic. During the late 1890s, these groups cemented into an intellectual and political movement called Aon France. This was in response to the Dreyfus Affair, which was a essentially drumhead military tribunal, kangaroo court type situation, in which a Jewish officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was accused of selling French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris. The scandal, both as a legal reality and as a cultural touchstone, lasted for a number of years until Dreyfus was finally acquitted in 1906. But it was a rallying point for a number of traditionalists and anti-Semitic currents within French culture. And they kludged into this group called Aon France. One of the major philosophical leaders of this movement was a poet named Charles Marat. Action Française carried on as a major political and cultural movement throughout the 1910s, 20s, and into the 1930s. And when the 1930s came around with the Depression, they sort of merged and married themselves to a lot of these leagues. The leagues were far-right, pro-fascist movements who were inspired by what Mussolini had done in Italy and what Hitler had done in Germany. A lot of them comprised mainly of veterans from the First World War who were upset with the way that the government had treated them and were upset that France didn't get more out of the First World War than it did as reparations. And along with anti-Semitism and an emphasis on traditional values, these leagues were staunchly anti-Republican, as they had seen that the Republic had failed most normal people. The Republic wasn't working in the interests of your average French citizen. And of course, a lot of these leagues were also disturbed by the rise of Bolshevism and socialist movements. Now, in the face of the violence that had led up to and had exploded on February the 6th, the French left counter-mobilized. They saw these demonstrations by the far right as an attempted fascist coup. And so from February 9th until February 11th, the street violence continued and escalated until February 12th. French trade union organizations and the French Communist Party called for a general strike. The French Communist Party and the French section of the Workers' International, the latter being joined by more center-left members of the Radical Party, organized separate demonstrations, which then met in the streets of Paris. And despite the fact that there was initially some tension and there were some fears that fighting would break out between the two groups, they unified against the what they saw as the rising fascist and right-wing current within France. And then this moment was the birth of the Popular Front. And while it would take years of organizing afterwards, the Popular Front eventually carried the 1936 elections and appointed Léon Blum as the Prime Minister of France. Now, what were these parties that I brought up that comprised the Popular Front? Well, I'm going to start from the most centrist to the most far left, not only because it's good blocking, but it's also good chronologically for the story of how these parties emerged. So this first group that I've been talking about, I referred to as the Radicals. Their real name were the Radical Socialists. Much like the Holy Roman Empire, they were neither radical nor socialist. The Radical Socialists had started off in the early days of the Third Republic as the most genuinely left-wing viable party in France. And in terms of where the French polity was at that time, they genuinely were the most radical and most socialist party. But by the 1930s, this was largely a legacy name. Most of the groups in French society that were further to the left had already split off to form their own parties, and so the radical socialists were largely a party of the center left and the center right. A lot of their members were small businessmen, intellectuals, sort of, to borrow a Marxist term, kind of the pure bourgeoisie as we would see it. And in terms of their ideals, while they did support some social policies, their main ideology was republicanism as an ideology, democracy, as it were. The first party to split away from the radical socialists were the French section of the Workers' International. Now, the French section of the Workers' International was a party that was mainly comprised of social democrats and democratic socialists. Now, here in America, our political conversation is a bit stunted by our history. A social democrat is essentially someone who wants to operate within the current system as it is to bring about evolutionary socialism, or at the very least some sort of society that is more socialist than the more capitalist-oriented societies that started to emerge at the end of the 19th century. Whereas in traditional terms, a democratic socialist is someone who wants to bring about large-scale social change towards socialism in a revolutionary but hopefully mostly peaceful way. Think of like Rosa Luxemburg would be a great example. Most of the members of this party came from the urban and rural working class and also some left-leaning intellectuals, but their main unifying tenet, which split them from those further on the left, was their rejection of Bolshevism. The symbol for the party during this time period were the three arrows. The three arrows traditionally stand for anti-monarchism, anti-fascism, and anti-Bolshevism. And then the third and final party was the French Communist Party, which had split off from the French section of the Workers' International. Originally, this was due to opposition to the French section's support for French involvement in the First World War, but they soon also adopted Bolshevism as part of their platform. And, of course, these were the most far-left elements of French society, the very poor urbanites, people who were in heavy industry but also were well-organized. Prior to 1934, these parties did not get along at all. They were all very deeply distrustful of one another. And so, given what I had described, it may come as something of a surprise that the formation of the Popular Front really was more due to the French Communist Party deciding to moderate, and it was the French Communists who reached out to the Radical Socialists in order to form this electoral alliance in the hopes of stemming the tide of rising far right-wing ideologies, but also finally do something about the Depression. Now, as a party of the center, the Radicals have been a part of almost every French government going back several decades before the 1930s. But despite being a major political party for 31 years, and often the largest or the second largest party in the Chamber of Deputies at this point, the Popular Front was the first time that the French section of the Workers' International was part of a governing coalition, let alone the leader of that coalition. Now back to the leader of the French section, Léon Blum. So who was Blum? Well, Blum was born to a middle-class Jewish family in Paris. He'd entered university in 1890 to study science and mathematics, but he left to pursue a career in law, despite the fact that he had an excellent academic record when he was studying the sciences. He first broke into politics as a writer of cultural and social criticism during the Dreyfus Affair. The rampant anti-Semitism at the time kind of worked both for and against Blum, since being hated and rejected in politics is bad. But the fact that he was Jewish and he was writing these pamphlets put a special target on him. Charles Marat himself often referred to Blum directly in a lot of Marat's public writings. And it really elevated Blum's stature as a public figure of the left. Blum's personal style helped with his rise after that. By all accounts, Blum was a very personable, humble, authentic, trustworthy person. And publicly, he was a good coalition builder, and he didn't really tend to demonize the opposition, and he was quite a sincere humanitarian. In fact, the title of the definitive biography on Blum is called Leon Blum, A Humanist in Politics. But he wasn't totally without guile, at least when it came to political tactics, and he wasn't naive either. But he did lack that kind of cynical cunning that's exhibited by a lot of people who think that they're really good at politics. But because he had been the leader of the French section since just after the First World War, in terms of actual governing experience, Blum had none. From the end of the First World War onwards, the French government comprised sort of increasingly fractured coalitions of small conservative and center-right parties. As I'd said, these coalitions were often bolstered by the radicals, and they formed into an electoral coalition known as the National Front, or the Republican Union, as it's sometimes called. This arrangement caused a certain stability by paralysis. It was difficult to move any large legislation because the National Front was unified only by their distrust of the left. And while things looked rather chaotic from the outside, inside, individual governing officials and special interests within the Third Republic developed protected fiefdoms within the mechanisms of the state and the bureaucracy. French Minister of War André Maginot was one of these individuals leading sort of one of these fiefdoms. Now, Maginot had served as Minister of War on and off for several years in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, but his connections with the French General Staff and the military-industrial complex meant that he was always pulling the strings, even when he wasn't technically the minister. And he was able to run the agenda for the two aforementioned groups more or less unchecked by democratic oversight during this period. Now, Maginot was a member of a party called the Democratic Alliance, which was one of these vaguely center-right political parties that were part of the National Front, who really didn't have any ideological objective other than just to preserve the status quo and protect special interest groups. Now, the Maginot Line itself was André Maginot's brainchild, and also, much like Churchill in the UK, Maginot identified Nazism externally and the far right internally as threats long before many others, and was able to sort of build support around a response. And had he not died in 1932 of typhoid fever at a relatively young age, history may have turned out very differently from the way it did. So I'm not saying that André Maginot was a bad guy. However, his ascendancy and how he retained power through various governments is kind of indicative of the larger problem with French politics and society at this time. None of these governments had any central project. There was no central unifying force. None of these guys were linked into a unified political project. It was all just a bunch of separate political totems who stood to protect a particular bureaucratic structure, or some sort of special interest group for the purpose of helping themselves and preventing any major changes to business as usual. And then this externally scattered, internally inflexible approach carried forward to how the government dealt with the Depression. Initially, the Great Depression was fairly mild in France. There were internal reasons for why this was that I'll get back to here in a little bit. But as the 1930s chugged on and the government reacted to the rising wave, kind of not unlike someone seeing waters rising towards their house year after year and assuming that it would recede eventually before they needed to do anything about it. And so the government simply refused or couldn't, because the interests were so scattered, do anything to help out the population at large. They mounted an austerity program instead of spending projects, aside from some military expenditures like the Maginot Line itself. And unlike the UK and other countries that had embraced austerity, the National Front and the radical-led government of France before 1936 refused to devalue their currency. Remember, as I discussed in my American politics videos, devaluing can relieve economic pressure on the poor and the working class if it's done correctly. So the combined policies of austerity and sort of sound money, keeping the value of the franc up, hurt enough. But on top of that, you have to add on the realities of how French industry was organized. And today, France is one of the countries that's seen as having the most advanced or sometimes most excessive workers' rights regime and protections, depending upon your point of view. Not so in the early 20th century. Most French industry operated off an extreme form of what's called Taylorism. Taylorism is what a lot of people think Fordism was, but for all of Henry Ford's faults and corrupt motives, Ford had refined an approach to industry that kept jobs from getting overly repetitive, and he offset the negatives of factory work with high wages and decent benefits for his time. Taylorism was a form of industrialism that turned every factory worker into a total automaton, with sort of the explicit intent of working them until they were no longer useful, providing as little compensation as possible in order to maximize productivity and profit. In the Taylorist ideal, you hire a new worker who sits on an assembly line with their only job being to turn a wrench 3 times in a very highly specified manner, and then they pass the item along. And they do this 5,000 times a day until their body gives out and they can't turn the wrench anymore, and then you just throw them out and discard them. And that's more or less how most French heavy industry was organized. So this approach caused a ton of problems, obviously. First, remember before I talked about the population crisis. Well, while the population stagnation of that type might normally lead manufacturers to automate and modernize, French manufacturers were used to making their profit margins by treating their human capital as though it was fully disposable and fully exploitable. Therefore, there was no incentive for them to invest in modernization that might have freed up more people to work in other important war industries or sectors of the economy that would have strengthened the French economy or society, or could have helped out at the front in a potential future war. The next problem is that because of the limited population pool, the industrial economy burned through people very quickly. In addition to disabled veterans from the war, France had a lot of people disabled from working in the factories and mines. They had full employment and high productivity, which is the thing that free market liberals value the most, but they were caught in a downward spiral of profits, production, and increasingly poor quality of life for working class people and the working poor. That last one probably contributed quite a bit to declining birth rates in France during this period. Not the liberal values so much, but the economic exploitation, declining quality of life. And then lastly, it's evil and inhumane. Regardless of if you are pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist, this is the most extremely capitalist you can get. Literally using people as human capital purely, for replacements for cogs in the machine. So in addition to the usual corruption and problems, all this stuff I've been talking about for the last few minutes was just an accepted part of life for French and political social establishment up until 1936 and the victory of the Popular Front. The Popular Front went to work pretty quickly following their win in June of 1936. The package of laws that they passed, which was known as the Maginot Accords, included protections for labor action, the right to strike, a minimum wage, 12 days paid vacation, a 40-hour work week, and several other reforms. At this point, the Popular Front held nearly 60% of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies, but this reform package got about 80% of the vote, despite these same reforms having been held up for decades prior, though the passage was aided by a general strike that was called just prior to the election. And then following the passage of the Maginot Accords, the Popular Front moved on to pass a group of bills that produced more backlash outside the Popular Front itself, and a few of the measures lost support from the right wing of the Radical Party. These reforms included opening meetings of the Board of the Bank of France to the public to get some sort of democratic oversight, nationalizing the arms industry, loans for small and medium-sized businesses, strengthening compulsory education, price breaks, infrastructure investment, abolishing the sales tax and instituting manufacturing taxes in their place. And then they also moved to dislodge some of the entrenched bureaucrats and some of the important governing institutions that I mentioned as being previously as being a feature of French governance. But in addition to immediate backlash from conservatives and market liberals, the reforms on business and industry caused major disruptions within French production and manufacturing. Remember what I just said about French manufacturing depending upon massive exploitation of the workforce to make up its profit margins. They'd operated this way for decades, so naturally changing that model changed the entire calculus for industrialists. And they started fighting back. Capital flight ensued, which led to more radicalization from market liberals and the right against Blum and his government, and the circle just kind of repeated itself over the next couple of years. In response to increased political tensions, the Popular Front passed legislation that outlawed the far-right leagues, which then led to charges of hypocrisy and suppression of free speech and even more radicalization. And then the direct attacks against entrenched interests in the government and against the military-industrial complex brought about even more resistance in the civil service and the military against the Popular Front's governing initiatives. One of the greatest ironies here being that the adoption of some of the best military equipment that the French carried into the Second World War, like the Samoa tank, the Moss 36 rifle, a lot of stuff that was often as good or better than what the Wehrmacht had in terms of their equipment, was adopted or entered large-scale production during the period of the Popular Front. Before the Popular Front came to power and nationalized the arms industries, the private manufacturers and the government were content to keep mass producing the outdated stuff in order to keep their production and profit margins down. However, production disruptions and lack of funding prevented full implementation of the newer stuff at the front. A number of officers in the French military were also fairly sympathetic to the arms industry prior to its nationalization, and were fairly sympathetic to a lot of right-wing veterans groups within France. Even in the best of times, there was a lot of distrust between the military and the Popular Front. And this meant that the military often did its own thing and sort of developed a culture of hiding problems from the government. Remember what I was saying before about the military exercises within the Ardennes, and Gamelin wanting to hide that potential embarrassment in order to save face and prevent political problems from developing. But the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War really accelerated tensions in France. Now, because of some ingrained biases that we have here in the English-speaking world, I think many people who have some knowledge of the Spanish Civil War believe that the war was started by left-wing revolutionaries. It wasn't. Spain had its own Popular Front versus National Front showdown. The two sides were actually also called that. And this was the supporters of the National Front who launched a coup and started the Civil War after the left narrowly won Spain's elections in 1936. The left in France wanted to intercede on the side of the Republicans in Spain. The centrists, for the most part, wanted to stay out of it, and some on the right actively threatened to follow the example of the Spanish right by bringing civil war to France. Blum essentially froze and sided towards an action to appease the political center and the radicals, despite calls for action within his own party. As the story goes, he was confronted by protesters outside the Palais Bourbon, and with tears in his eyes, kept repeating over and over again to the crowd, "I can't, I can't." And so this kind of marked a growing trend towards an action that eventually ended Blum's government. As I'd said before, Blum was a true believer in the Republic. Why wouldn't he be? The Republic had taken, in his own lifetime, he had gone from a situation where he personally experienced rabid anti-Semitism, rabid anti-Jewish bias within society and within government, and then had himself become prime minister. And so he kind of had every reason to believe that the system worked if it were allowed to. And of course, Blum's natural inclination was towards humanitarianism. And while he took a harder line against external fascism than France took before him or after him, Churchill actually wrote pretty extensively that he preferred working with Blum and his ministers over working with Daladier later, because not unlike in the UK, where a lot of Churchill's best supporters on the German question were from the Labour Party, Churchill saw a lot more conviction in Blum's leftists than he saw in the centrists or the conservatives to take a stand against Germany. But he wasn't willing to let things come to violence internally. And he held this line despite the fact that he himself had been brutally beaten before the 1936 election by a group of far right-wing extremists in the streets of Paris. So this political violence was something he had personally had experience with. The communists started falling out of line with the Popular Front and Blum over Spain, and even some of the members of Blum's own party lost enthusiasm for the government. Blum also started hitting the brakes on a number of the Popular Front's more aggressive reform plans for the economy and social reforms. And he did this in an effort to appease the radical center. It sounds like a contradiction, but the centrist radicals, there we go, and also to try to stem the tide of growing right-wing extremism within the country. He delayed his initial efforts to devalue the franc and to add more money into the economy, and so the currency remained inflexible longer than would have been ideal with all of these other manufacturing reforms going on. And so investment started drying up and unemployment started rising. And then with those two factors in place, inflation skyrocketed despite Blum's monetary reforms not being particularly aggressive. Blum personally wanted to take the investors to task. He wanted to take the bond markets to task. He wanted to further his reforms, but he wasn't able to do so within the established norms of French governance. And as I said before, Blum was someone who valued the norms. And so he essentially allowed himself to be put into this passive position, not able to act. And while the Popular Front's initiatives in the early days, they had a whirlwind of legislative accomplishments that rivaled the New Deal, that momentum didn't hold either. Unlike FDR, who had a few major goals with social programs, but otherwise was willing to try anything that might work in order to try to make people's lives better, to try to shift power balance within the country, and to build the impression for the average person that things were improving. Blum fell victim to a fairly common mistake that a lot of progressives make when they get into power during an emergency. It's something that's sometimes called planism. That's when you sort of spend months or even years constructing technocratic plans for sort of big structural change, which often fail to launch because such things are hard to explain to the public. Those types of big plans are easy to attack, and it's difficult to guide through the legislative process with the competing special interests. Again, sort of in contrast to FDR, FDR was more inclined to, within the governing norms, without going overboard, and with public support, sort of act first and then ask for permission later. And Blum was never really willing to do that. And so the French economy just more or less kept spinning its wheels through 1936 to 1938. Eventually, with the loss of communist support, with the loss of support from the centrist radicals, Blum's government fell. And the radicals took over the government, and they appointed Edouard Daladier as the new prime minister of France. You may recognize that name from all the way back when I started talking about the political and social situation in France. Daladier was the man who was so weak that his government was toppled in one day by the 6th of February riots. And while Daladier had been there all along, he rehabilitated his reputation after the 6th of February. He had steered the Radical Party into the Popular Front and was Minister of War for the first years of the Popular Front. Daladier was in a lot of ways the personality opposite of Blum. Where Blum was humble, Daladier was ambitious. Where Blum was authentic, Daladier was a flatterer who also liked to be flattered. And while Blum oftentimes tried to talk it out when there was a decent chance of some sort of deal or compromise, Daladier often avoided conflict by staying quiet when other people might tell him things that he didn't want to hear. Where Blum had moral purpose, Daladier tended to just listen to the last person who said something that he liked, and so on and so on. Daladier, by all accounts, was fairly petty. He kind of allowed the tides to take him wherever they were leading. He sort of lacked conviction. In general, he seems to have had a humanitarian impulse, but it was very much guided by the thoughts and opinions of those who were immediately around him, which certainly led to a lot of problems. For instance, during the Munich agreements, when Daladier sort of had the correct read on Hitler, believed that Hitler would not follow the agreements, but he was essentially talked out of doing anything by Chamberlain. And then Daladier allowed financial and industrial interests to talk him into going back on the Matignon Accords, and those two together, the Munich agreements and going back on the Accords, were what led the communists to finally pull out of the Popular Front coalition. And while the accomplishments of the Popular Front in the long term were somewhat limited, the fact that they had pushed a center-left to left-wing agenda provided a lot of impetus for conservatives to fight back. During the years of the Popular Front governance, the French right marched under the slogan, "Better Hitler than Blum." The fact that the Popular Front had failed to take on the bond markets and financial interests was used against them. They said that the left was secretly in the hands of international finance, which was kind of true of the radicals. But then they also said it was Jewish finance because of Blum. And of course, these articles were printed in papers that were owned by the financiers themselves. A number of French papers started repeating stories that Blum was not really who he said he was, that he had changed his identity, that he was secretly an Eastern European Jew who hadn't been born in France, and that he was friends with the Rothschilds and used their money to steal the election. All these things were obvious and absurd lies. But the more time that the Popular Front spent media resources combating these lies, the louder that they got, and the less time the papers spent talking about quality of life issues and the Popular Front's platform on that. And so with that and the actual economic conditions in the country, the Popular Front's own popularity kept weakening. And the fact that the conservative papers had spent all of this time talking about the internal threat as they saw it, raising all these concerns about Blum, that meant that they did not spend that time talking about the external threat of Germany and on the threat of aggressive German actions. Blum didn't really realize just how much opposition there was in the General Staff toward the Popular Front and toward the Republic. Now, Gamelin had hidden things from the government while he was General Chief of Staff, but his actions after the defeat proved that he was loyal to the Republic. When the time came to replace Gamelin and there was a reshuffle in the War Cabinet, of which Blum was still a member, Blum retained his membership in the War Cabinet because he was still the leader of the French section. Blum did not oppose the appointment of Philippe Pétain to the cabinet, nor did he oppose the appointment of Maxime Weygand as the General Chief of Staff. And both of them proved to be far-right sympathizers, and once they were appointed, they were the biggest voices for defeatism within the government. They sought any opportunity they could to say that the war was hopeless, that the soldiers had given up, the trade unions were undermining the war effort, and that Britain had betrayed them, so on and so on and so on. So going back to what I had said in the first part of this video about how the French forces were figuring out ways to combat and counter German tactics, how isolated pockets of French soldiers did have the morale to carry on, and there were some generals within the French military who were willing to fight on even after the order for surrender was given. Why couldn't they turn this around? Well, it may go a little far to say that the fall of France was an inside job, but given the predilections of a number of the people within the French general staff, especially after Gamelin was relieved of his command, and given what happened in the immediate aftermath with the French military insisting that their soldiers retreat, insisting that the situation was hopeless, and given how readily they surrendered to Hitler, and how readily afterwards people like Pétain were willing to make statements that this had been the wrong war, that this was a quote, Jewish war that had been led by Blum, it does seem that while things may not have gone according to a plan, there certainly was a general attitude that favored the far right and the German cause. Now, after France fell, the Popular Front specifically, and the left and liberal values more generally, took most of the blame for France's instability. And even a lot of people who normally wouldn't sympathize with this viewpoint tend to accept a lot of the central tenets of this notion, and they'll say that the Popular Front was just, quote, the wrong time, or that they pushed too hard. And they end up ignoring a lot of the long-standing issues that the Popular Front and the people who had voted for them were trying to have addressed. And then you also get this link between the Popular Front and the Maginot mentality. So why do we think this now? Why are there so many historians and online YouTube commentators who will tell you that all this was just the fault of the Popular Front? Well, contrary to popular belief, there was a good deal of continuity in the French government after the surrender in 1940, at least initially. The appointment of Pétain as prime minister and then later chief of state and the dismantling of the Republic were all technically legal acts that followed the established legislative process. Now, granted, the Communist Party was outlawed and their legislators were all expelled, and some members of the French section and the Radical Party had fled, but the government continued to hold legislative meetings of the deputies in Vichy. And most of the members of the Radical Party showed up, and out of all the deputies there, only 80 of them voted against measures ending the Republic. Blum was amongst those 80, and he and the other members kept showing up for sessions in the Vichy government, even though they knew that it would almost certainly eventually lead to their arrest or being killed outright. And then Blum eventually was arrested, along with Gamelin and Daladier and several other officials. Now, as I said, the Vichy government was not a clean slate. For the most part, it was the same people around before the surrender, backed by the same interest groups who backed the conservatives and the market liberals and the far right prior. Now, in a lot of ways, this actually made more of an imperative for the new Vichy government to craft a narrative that casts blame on people who they had identified as problems before the fall, in order to take blame away from themselves and take blame away from collaborationist generals and politicians. And so, the fall of France was blamed on leftists, Republicans, degraded morals. There were accusations of generalized incompetence in the governing staff, etc., etc. And then they also employed one of the favorite philosophical turns of governments like this, that being to cast any actions that they take as a reasonable correction to the left and to liberal extremism.
Why did you make me do this?
The French government brought forward these and more accusations during the Riom trials. These were the trials of the leaders of the Popular Front and also Maurice Gamelin for alleged treason against France. Because of the structure of the trials, Léon Blum ended up being essentially the primary defendant within the trials, And it turns out that the government somewhat underestimated him. They seem to have completely forgotten that Blum was an attorney and was a very good attorney, and that he was known for his ability to argue a point. Now, normally none of this would have mattered at all. When you're in a position where you're that disempowered, it doesn't matter whether you make a really good philosophical argument or not. What matters in the end is who has the power. However, as I said, the French government really underestimated Blum. They seem to have believed that this was going to be an easy show trial. But as I said before, while Blum was not an opportunist, he was not cynical, he also wasn't without guile. And he still had a sharp mind and was able to defend himself and others against the accusations that were leveled before them. The government of France believed that this was going to be an easy win. And so for the first few days of the trial, they allowed the cameras in, they allowed the newspapers in, and they leveled accusations against Blum and the Popular Front, accusations that they had endangered France by cutting focus on defense. Blum countered that actually the only time that there had been any budget cuts to the French national defense was when the center-right governments were in charge in 34 and 35. But true to the type of person that he was, Blum not only defended himself, he not only defended against the government's accusations and countered them by pointing out the faults of the National Front. He also defended Daladier when accusations came that Daladier had undermined the status of France's alliance with Italy. He defended the communists, even though the communists had turned their back on the National Front, and a number of them were now dead in the streets because they had directly opposed Vichy government rule. When the government said that the communists and the trade unionists had sabotaged the arms industry at the orders of Moscow, this included accusations that the communists had removed firing pins from guns, had sent incomplete equipment to the front, things like that. Stuff that, again, is oftentimes repeated by some YouTube commenters on historical matters. Blum pointed out that actually this had been a long-standing problem, that the arms industry had no checks on them, and they frequently sent subpar equipment to the military before his government came into power. When the government came after Gamelin and accused him of treasonous levels of incompetence and said that he had left Wagan with a situation that was impossible to win, Blum again defended Gamelin and said that the situation was not impossible, that they could have recovered. However, it was the defeatism of Pétion and of Wagan that had caused the defeat. And it goes on and on and on. And even in the censored press environment in France, even with everything else that was going on, even with the entire weight of the government against them, this was all very embarrassing for the Vichy government. Even, as I said, even with a censored press, the general attitude that a lot of people in the public were getting was that the Vichy government was an embarrassment. These center-right parties that had taken over after the downfall of the Popular Front had mismanaged things very poorly, and it generated a lot of sympathy for the French resistance movements internationally as well, because the international media got their crack at covering this. But eventually Pétion stepped in and said that he decreed that everybody involved in the trials was guilty, or at least guilty enough that for the protection of the state they needed to be arrested. And so at this point you might be asking, well, wait, so are you saying that all of this stuff that's out there that's commonly believed about how the Popular Front was too revolutionary, too left-wing, or how the French government and the French higher-ups carried the wrong mindset into the war, and that this is the reason for France's defeat, any of this other stuff, this is just straight Vichy propaganda? Is that what you're saying? Well, yeah, that kind of is what I'm saying. And so why has it had been allowed to survive past the Vichy regime. Well, the war did eventually end. And when the war ended, other than a few people who had been hardcore collaborators with the Nazi regime, very few French cultural, social, media, industrial, political, or governmental leaders or military leaders ever ended up going to prison long term for any of this, unless they, of course, were imprisoned by the regime in Vichy. Meanwhile, a number of the people who had continued to resist after the fall of France, after the surrender of France to Germany, a lot of them ended up dead. And so the thinking is, much as in my Oppenheimer video when I talked about Japan, the thinking is that life does have to go on. And of course, for the people who sat around and did nothing or were complacent atrocities, well, they start the struggle for the narrative. And so the narrative that came out of all of this was that the government that arose at the end of the 1930s, in order to address a lot of the problems that were going on France, just did too much, tried to do too much, and the arrogance of the French general staff let everybody down. And then in a lot of ways, this became the accepted political narrative in France with the rise of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle wanted a strong France. He wanted a France that would not be fractured by democratic excess as he saw it. He wanted a culturally and socially unified France. And so a lot of this, and of course, a lot of these people he personally had attachments to. He was a protege of Wagand's, even though Wagand was a traitor, and Wagand continued to live after the war, and so perhaps de Gaulle did not want to smear Wagand's legacy. But de Gaullism is eventually what really cemented the legacy of a lot of these myths in people's eyes. So just to close out here, what ended up becoming of a lot of the folks that we've been talking about in this video? Well, Blum was arrested and eventually ended up at Dachau concentration camp, but survived the war. The concentration camp guards there kept him alive because they believed that he was important to the USSR. Mistakenly, they bought this propaganda about some sort of unified communist Jewish conspiracy. And so, much to their chagrin, they found out that that wasn't the case, but because of this weird happenstance, Blum ended up surviving the war. He ended up something of a valued elder statesman in France. He retook control over the French section of the Workers' International, became the party leader again, and became an important person within the Chamber of Deputies. But throughout the rest of his life, he was followed by accusations that he must have made some sort of deal with the Nazis in order to survive the concentration camps when others hadn't. There's something of a recurring theme, you might say, of right-wingers accusing Jews who survived the Holocaust of having been co-conspirators with the Nazis. It's a prevalent narrative even to today. Daladier and Gamelin also ended up surviving the war. They were sent to Castle Eider, which was a castle in the Alps where a number of French political prisoners were kept. They ended up surviving after the Battle of Castle Eider, which is a fascinating instance in history. I'm amazed that there's never been a major movie made about it. The commandant of the camp, as the war was closing out, refused an order to eliminate all the prisoners and instead went to the nearest American forces that he could find, and a combined American and German Wehrmacht unit essentially assaulted the castle against the SS officers, and the commandant, Major Josef Gengel, was the only person who was killed in this assault on the Allied side. Interestingly enough, the two of them were eventually joined by Maxime Maginot. Maginot was arrested in 1942 and was imprisoned after he had refused direct orders from the Vichy government and, by extension, from the Germans. It wasn't because he had grown a heart and gone soft on leftist resistors or refused the orders to round up Jews, or because he refused orders to just execute average French citizens who appeared to be resisting the government. No, he carried out all those orders with glee. The reason he was arrested was because he protested orders to turn over French overseas bases to the Germans. He believed that this was a gross violation of France's imperial sovereignty. And so Pétion signed the order to have him arrested. And not long after that, the Chamber of Deputies was also essentially dissolved as well and was reduced to a rump governing council of really hardcore devoted fascists. And so these people who all stood there and watched Blum come into the chamber day after day, knowing that it would probably kill him in the end, and still did nothing, still voted for all of these measures that dismantled the Republic, well, they got to see what the result of that was in the end. And then lastly, Pétion was captured eventually by the Allies. He was held in prison for a while, but eventually they had determined that he was too senile to be held accountable for his own actions, and his status as a hero in the First World War essentially acquitted him from any trial or long-term responsibility. And then Maginot also survived and ended up avoiding any long-term consequences for what he had done, because in the end he did stand up to and was arrested by the Nazis, even if the reasons that he stood up to them weren't the right ones. And so that's the video, everybody. You may have noticed several voice changes during this video. That's because my health was not great for the last 2 months. And so I had a lot of on days and a lot of off days, and I kept trying to kind of record through that. But if you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. If you have any comments, please leave a comment. It was a long video, and there were some things that I probably would have liked to expand upon, but I didn't want it to be a 2-hour video. So I do plan to make a coda video for this where I cover a few things that I couldn't touch on. I have more ideas soon for upcoming videos, so look out for those. And I appreciate everybody listening, and have a good day, everybody. Take care.